Thank you very much. This is my first time ever in Madrid, and what an amazing place. And I'm very daunted to be talking to you about the fantastic in a gallery which contains Goya and Bosch. I have just been shown some pictures for free, and I'm not sure that I can offer anything to compete with those, but let's see. I am going to talk about novels. I'm going to talk about Gothic fiction. And I am going to try to understand why some very strange and some people might say rather silly stories, rather foolish stories, worked their way into the bloodstream of English fiction, of some of the greatest writers of the 19th century. And I always, when I am giving a talk, start with Jane Austen. Whatever the talk is about, I always start with Jane Austen. Okay? And this is an extract from Jane Austen's novel Northanger Abbey. And it was published after her death. She died in 1817. It was published in 1818. But she wrote it much earlier, in the 1790s. And she wrote it in order to satirize the fiction that was fashionable at that time, Gothic novels. In this novel, the heroine, who is called Catherine, is obsessed with Gothic novels. She reads them all the time, and she makes the mistake of thinking that life might be like a Gothic novel. We all, every country has stories about how people are misled by their reading. You have Don Quixote. The French have Madame Bovary. We have Northanger Abbey. I'm not saying it is as good as Don Quixote or Madame Bovary, but it's quite amusing. And in this novel, Catherine, the heroine, has been invited to stay in a country house owned by a man called General Tilney. And he is the father of the man, Henry Tilney, who she has met in Bath and who she thinks maybe she loves. Maybe. And she thinks that he is interested in her. Maybe. After all, she has been invited to stay. And the house where she stays is an abbey. This is very promising because all Catherine's favorite novels, Gothic novels, take place in old buildings. And I will be talking quite a lot about old buildings. So she arrives at this thrilling old building, some of which was once a religious building. And she finds that Henry's father, General Tilney, is a frightening man, powerful, and sometimes angry. And she finds that his wife has died in mysterious circumstances. Okay, mysterious circumstances. I'm not sure what the translator is telling you is mysterious circumstances, but I think you know what I mean. And Catherine becomes convinced that General Tilney has been responsible for her death. He is like a villain from a Gothic novel. Or perhaps, no. Perhaps she is not dead. Perhaps she is kept imprisoned in a wing of the house, which is shut off and locked. For there are many locked doors in this house. And one day, when everyone else is out, Catherine investigates. And she gets into what were once Mrs. Tilney's private rooms. But then Henry suddenly returns and finds her. What are you doing? And from her explanation, for she is not good at lying, he realizes what fantasies she has been indulging. He thinks of the plot that she has been imagining, and he asks her to wake up. And he says this, I will read it. He is talking to her in what was once his mother's bedroom. Consult your own understanding, your own sense of the probable, your own observation of what is passing around you. Does our education prepare us for such atrocities? Do our laws connive at them? Could they be perpetrated without being known in a country like this, where social and literary intercourse is on such a footing, where every man is surrounded by a neighborhood of voluntary spies, and where roads and newspapers lay everything open? Dearest Miss Morland, what ideas have you been admitting? They had reached the end of the gallery, and with tears of shame, she ran off to her own room. End of chapter. End of love affair? No, don't worry. Voluntary spies is interesting. Voluntary spies are probably the servants with which all these people are surrounded all the time. Henry Tilney is saying to Catherine Morland, it would not be very easy to murder your wife in this house. It would not be very easy to do anything without being observed. She is mortified. The next chapter begins, the visions of romance were over. Catherine was completely awakened. And perhaps you could remember that when we look at some of the passages that follow, because Gothic novels in England are often about that process we all know very well of falling asleep, dreaming, and then waking up. And in Northanger Abbey, Catherine often goes to sleep at the end of one chapter with strange ideas in her head, but then wakes up to reality in the next chapter. So what were these novels, these fantasies that filled Catherine's head? Where did they come from? Gothic novels began as a joke, un jeu d'esprit. This is the title page of the first edition of the first English Gothic novel, published on Christmas Eve, 1764. It says 1765. Oh, sorry, but that is not right. And you will see that it pretends to be a rediscovered old object. The Castle of Atranto, a story translated by William Marshall Gent from the original Italian of Onufrio Muralto, canon of the Church of St. Nicholas in Otranto. None of this is all untrue. This is all a fiction. The novel was in fact written by a man called Horace Walpole. His father had been the Prime Minister of Britain, the first and longest serving Prime Minister of Britain, Sir Robert Walpole. And it was not an old book. It was written by a man who was very educated and very modern. But it presented itself as a fragment of antiquity. In the second edition, the title page declared it to be not a story, but, as it is here, but a Gothic story. The Castle of Atranto, a Gothic story. The first time the word Gothic was ever used to describe a narrative, a novel. And Gothic, when Walpole used the word in the mid-18th century, Gothic meant barbarous, barbaric, uncivilized. And when he used it for his story, he was deliberately using a word which was often used to condemn things as being uncivilized. It is a story of a tyrannical prince, Manfred, who has been cursed as a usurper and who, like many tyrants in Gothic novels, is driven by his lust for a young woman. The young woman is due to marry his son, his only son. But on the day of the marriage, a giant helmet, I warn you, this is not a realistic story, a giant helmet falls from the sky and crushes his son to death. Good. Now Manfred can marry Isabella, who was going to marry his son. And much of the novel consists of his pursuit of Isabella through caverns and secret passageways. There are always caverns and secret passageways in Gothic novels. In this, the first Gothic novel, there are ghosts and supernatural phenomena. And Manfred is haunted by the spirits of the past. In the opening of the novel, in the very first chapter, when he reveals his design of marrying the young woman who was to have married his son and getting rid of his own wife, he'll divorce her and send her to a nunnery, of course. One of the portraits in the gallery comes to life, and his grandfather steps out of the portrait to warn him against this action. Okay? So It is, if you have read Stephen King novels, perhaps you're beginning to realize the territory we're in and where Stephen King got it from. So there are many supernatural occurrences in this novel, and the characters are always worried about the supernatural. They are haunted by apprehensions. And here is a dialogue between Bianca, who is a servant. All servants in Gothic novels are very, very superstitious. And her mistress, who is called Matilda, who is Manfred's daughter. But he has renounced her because she is not a son. And they are in the castle. And you will know that if you spend the night in a castle, I can see many of you have done this. If you spend the night in a castle, you start hearing things. Blessed Mary, said Bianca, starting. There it is again. Dear madam, do you hear nothing? This castle is certainly haunted. Peace, said Matilda, and listen. I did think I heard a voice, but it must be fancy. Your terrors, I suppose, have infected me. Indeed, madam, said Bianca, half weeping with agony. I am sure I heard a voice. Does anybody lie in the chamber beneath? Said the princess. Nobody has dared to lie there, answered Bianca, since the great astrologer that was your brother's tutor drowned himself. You are right to laugh, because Walpole is always on the edge between terror and laughter. Yes? This book was taken very seriously by many of the first readers, and some of the very first readers even believed it was truly an old tale. But Walpole was having a very elaborate and sophisticated joke. He loved medieval ruins. He loved old buildings. He especially loved castles and medieval buildings. He loved them so much, he made himself one. This is in London. Incredibile. It is, it's in London. You can go on the tube train to see it. It is called Strawberry Hill. Strawberry Hill, okay? It is a good name, yes? Strawberry Hill. What's the Spanish for strawberry? Fresa. Fresca, okay. Okay. Well, I'm getting it wrong, am I? I'm getting it wrong. Okay, but Strawberry Hill, you understand. He did not make up the name. He found it in an old property deed. And now on the railway network, it is called Strawberry Hill because Walpole invented it. And he bought a house, and he expanded the house, and he turned it into his own little castle. This is from one side, this is from the other. Not a little castle, actually. Quite big. Only one man lived in it, him and his servants. And he spent about 20 years developing it. And he filled it with a collection of old artifacts. And these were a strange jumble. Etruscan vases, Indian arrows, Roman urns, anything very old, jumbled up together. And he lived in his own fantasy. He wrote many, many letters. And this is one of his letters to a man he only met once, but to whom he wrote hundreds of letters, because Horace Mann was a British diplomat living in Florence, Firenze. And they wrote letters to each other. And Mann wrote to him about his house and said, you're building a Gothic house, do you have a Gothic garden? And Walpole replied, I perceive you have no idea what Gothic is. You have lived too long amidst true taste to understand venerable barbarism. Yes? Man lives in Florence, the very apex of the Renaissance. Yes? How can he understand barbarism, which is what Walpole loves? You say you suppose my garden is to be Gothic too. That can't be. Gothic is merely architecture. And as one has a satisfaction in imprinting the gloomph of abbeys and cathedrals on one's house, so one's garden, on the contrary, is to be nothing but riant, laughing, happy, smiling, and the gaiety of nature. The house, like an ancient castle or abbey, will be full of gloomph. Walpole invented this word. I don't know if there are any people here who are very, very good at English, but many of you will know that gloom is an English word. But Walpole invented this word, which is now in the Oxford English Dictionary, gloomf, which is like warmth, yes? In English, you say something is warm and you feel warmth. Now, Walpole says you can say something is gloomy and you can feel gloomth, yes? And again, he relishes it, but it is also a joke. Everything for Walpole is a bit of a joke. And his architectural Gothic fantasy was very, very elaborate. This is the gallery at Strawberry Hill, recently restored. Fantastic, yes? Fantastic. This is his home. And you will see, in imitation of a medieval fan-vaulted ceiling, he has this ceiling here. It is made of papier-mâché. Yes? It is all a stage set. It is all a pretense. And he expects you to know that. Here is the library. Yes? And those wonderful Gothic bookcases made in imitation of some medieval religious building, but to contain his books. Walpole's house became celebrated. People could go to visit it. You can visit it now. But in his own day, you could visit it. It was open from 10 o'clock, from 10 o'clock in the morning, from May to September, and you could go round it. There was no charge. And in his own lifetime, more than 10,000 people visited his house. Yes? And he wrote his own guide to the house. And he had his own printing press to produce these novels and guides. Yes? It's a good thing he inherited plenty of money. So this was the original Gothic fantasy. And from the man who wrote the original Gothic novel. And as I said, something of a joke. An elaborate, expensive joke. But the next person who really took this up was not joking at all. And this was Anne Radcliffe in the 1790s, some 20 or 30 years after Walpole, who made this new genre of fiction, the Gothic novel, not just hugely popular, but actually respectable. And this is the reason, I think, why Jane Austen wanted to satirize it. She wanted to satirize it not because it was silly, but because some people didn't realize it was silly. With Walpole, you would never make that mistake. Here is a typical piece of an Anne Radcliffe novel. This is from her second novel, A Sicilian Romance. And it is two characters, two women speaking to each other. They live in a castle, of course. All these novels are set in the 16th century, usually round about the 16th century. So they're always set in the past, and they're always set in a different country, usually Italy, sometimes France, occasionally Spain. A country where, as far as the English novelist is concerned, very strange things happen, and many people are Roman Catholics. A Sicilian Romance happens in Sicily, and they are talking in a castle. They were engaged in interesting discourse when Madame, who was then speaking, was interrupted by a low, hollow sound which arose from beneath the apartment and seemed like the closing of a door. Chilled into silence, they listened and distinctly heard it repeated. Deadly ideas crowded upon their imaginations and inspired a terror which scarcely allowed them to breathe. The noise lasted only for a moment, and a profound silence soon ensued. Terror is what Anne Radcliffe offers her readers. She herself was to say, I always give them terror, but never horror. Yes? Never horror. Horror is when you see something really terrible. Terror is when you think you might see something really terrible. That is what Anne Radcliffe was interested in. I have taken the title of my talk from a poem which is inserted into this novel. Anne Radcliffe thought she was a rather good poet. How to get her poems published? An easy way: write novels and then put the poems into the mouths of the characters. So this is from a poem by Anne Radcliffe, sung to a lute by a young woman in the novel. And it is a poem to evening. Evening is a very important time of day in Gothic novels. Yes? You know that. Yes? Even in Dracula, evening. Yes? Night is frightening, yes. But evening worse. Yes? Evening as the light ebbs away. And you fear what might come next. Anne Radcliffe loves evening. Still through the deepening gloom of bowery shades, to fancy's eye fantastic forms appear. And that's my title, Fantastic Forms. Low whispering echoes steal along the glades and thrill the ear with wildly pleasing fear. Parent of shades, this is evening. parent of shades, of silence, dewy airs, of solemn musing and of vision wild. To thee, my soul, her pensive tribute bears, and halts, and hails thy gradual step, thy influence mild. So, gloom again, not gloomth, not gloomth, but gloom there, which is a key Gothic word. And to fancy's eye, fantastic forms appear. In evening, when the light is almost gone, you start seeing things, maybe. And you start experiencing wildly pleasing fear. And Radcliffe puts her finger on what has become, for writers and filmmakers the world over, a very important idea, that sensitive people might be pleased by fear, might enjoy fear. And this is what Radcliffe offered. In the evening, in the world of gloom of a Gothic novel, your perceptions, your fancy, your imagination they are all made more intense. And that is something strangely to be enjoyed. Her most important novel was the one referred to most often by Jane Austen, and it was called The Mysteries of Udolpho. And it was published in 1794, and for a while after it was published, it was one of the most famous, celebrated novels in all Europe. And it is the novel that Catherine Morland is reading in Northanger Abbey alongside her friend Isabella Thorpe. So they are two teenage girls reading novels. And here they are talking about them. And Isabella has gone further in the novel. Have you gone on with Udolpho, says Isabella. Yes, says Catherine. I have been reading it ever since I woke, and I am got to the Black Veil. Are you indeed? How delightful. Oh, I would not tell you what is behind the Black Veil for the world. Are not you wild to know? Oh, yes, quite. What can it be? But do not tell me. I would not be told upon any account. I know, it must be a skeleton. I'm sure it is Laurentina's skeleton. Oh, I'm delighted with the book. I should like to spend my whole life in reading it. It's like, she's a teenager, yes? I would like to spend my whole life in reading. That's what, teenagers, okay. I assure you, if it had not been to meet you, I would not have come away from it for all the world. Dear creature, how much I'm obliged to you. And when you have finished Udolpho, we will read The Italian together, also by Anne Radcliffe. And I have made out a list of 10 or 12 more of the same kind for you. Lots of exclamation marks. They're teenagers. Yes. Here is the title page of The Mysteries of Udolpho. And you'll see interspersed with some pieces of poetry. And you'll also see the subtitle, a romance. And you might remember that word. I've used it several times already. Her earlier novel was called A Sicilian Romance. And do you remember at the beginning of the lecture, this is a test? I'm joking, it's not a test. Do you remember me saying that when Catherine realized how foolish she had been, it said in the novel, the visions of romance were over. romance was the word they used in Britain for stories, novels, where improbable things happened, where it was possible, at least, that the supernatural might happen. Romance were fantastic stories, as opposed to other novels which took pride in giving you the world as it is. So the key word for 18th century novels, written at the same time as Walpole and Radcliffe were writing, was probability. They were stories about real people in real places. Not princes, not Italy, not ghosts, not nuns. We will come to nuns. So these are romances. All Radcliffe's novels have the same elements. This one takes its name, Udolpho, from a castle in the Apennines. And into this castle, ruled by the dark, Byronic Count Montoni, Emily, our heroine, is taken. Will she survive? Will she preserve her virginity? Yes, she will. The novel is narrated from her point of view, and we must experience all her fears. And in the castle, she thinks she sees things, she thinks she hears things. Remember Catherine Morland waking up, waking up at the beginning of a new chapter. Here, this happens all the time in the Mysteries of Udolpho. Here is a typical example. She almost fancied she saw shapes flit past her curtains and glide into the remote obscurity of her chamber. The castle clock struck 1 before she closed her eyes to sleep. New chapter. And Anne Radcliffe introduced this new fashion, which then was followed by lots of other writers. George Eliot, for instance, always does this, of having an epigraph at the beginning of a chapter. And very often, Anne Radcliffe has epigraphs from Shakespeare, as if to say, Shakespeare wrote about these things too. He had ghosts, so why not me? You will be unsurprised to hear that the play she quotes most often in her novels is, no, not Hamlet, Macbeth. Somebody got it right here. Macbeth, of course, Macbeth. Yes. And this is Brutus in Julius Caesar when he's visited by the ghost of Caesar. I think it is the weakness of mine eyes that shapes this monstrous apparition. It comes upon me. And it is a very well-chosen quotation because Brutus is saying, no, it's the weakness of my eyes. It can't be a real ghost. But it's Shakespeare, so it is a real ghost. And then daylight dispelled from Emily's mind the glooms of superstition, but not those of apprehension. And this is Anne Radcliffe's favourite word, apprehension. And apprehension is a state of worry, but it's a state of heightened sensitivity. All your faculties are abuzz. Yes? And apprehension is something that only happens to very clever, imaginative people. And the process in a Radcliffe novel is fulfilled over and over again. Apprehension, terror, and then rationalization. You realize it wasn't a ghost after all. And just because I thought you would want to know about it, here is the veil. Here is the veil that Isabella and Catherine were talking about. In one of the rooms in the castle, Emily, like Catherine, exploring where she should not go, finds a black veil. What can be behind it? I mean, filmmakers still use this, don't they? It is primitive but irresistible. She doesn't want to, and she wants to, and she pulls it back. It seemed to conceal a recess of the chamber. She wished, yet dreaded, to lift it, to discover what it veiled. Twice she was withheld by a recollection of the terrible spectacle her daring hand had formerly unveiled in an apartment of the castle, till, suddenly conjecturing that it concealed the body of her murdered aunt, she seized it in a fit of desperation and drew it aside. Beyond appeared a corpse, stretched on a kind of low couch, which was crimsoned with human blood, as was the floor beneath. The features, deformed by death, were ghastly and horrible, and more than one livid wound appeared in the face. Emily, bending over the body, gazed for a moment with an eager, frenzied eye. But in the next, the lamp dropped from her hand. She's always dropping the lamp. The lamp dropped from her hand and she fell senseless at the foot of the couch. End of chapter. Here is the accompanying illustration. The first edition was not illustrated. This is the fourth edition of 1796, which has illustrations. And there is the famous moment. Ah! And the illustrations tell you quite a lot about what goes on. Here's another bit of the novel. Emily is always being led down dark passageways and underground corridors by men with beards who might be friends but might not. Yes? Who is your friend? You never know. Well, if it's a man, you never know. And these are the books. This is the book above all that Catherine is intoxicated by, but that many, many readers were intoxicated by. Here is a bit, again from Northanger Abbey, which shows another influence of Anne Radcliffe in a kind of comical way. Radcliffe was famous for her landscape descriptions. The Apennines, Mount Etna, yes, lots of mountains, lots of gloom, or as we know, Walpole would have said, gloomph. And here is Catherine in Bath, going for a walk. I don't know if any of you have been to Bath. There's a kind of cliff above Bath. And if you walk up there, you can see this very civilized 18th century town laid out geometrically in front of you. But even now, Catherine is thinking of the Mysteries of Udolpho. They determined on walking around Beechin Cliff, that noble hill, whose beautiful verdure, that's trees, and hanging coppice render it so striking an object from almost every opening in Bath. I never look at it, said Catherine, as they walked along the side of the river, without thinking of the south of France. You have been abroad then? Said Henry, a little surprised. Oh, no. I only mean what I've read about. It always puts me in mind of the country that Emily and her father travelled through in the Mysteries of Udolpho. But you never read novels, I dare say. This joke is actually quite a complicated one, because when she wrote those novels, in France, in Spain, in Italy, Radcliffe had never herself been out of Britain. She based her lengthy natural descriptions, for which she was much admired, entirely on travel books and paintings. Here is a little typical bit from a Sicilian Romance. This is the heroine Julia's guardian, female guardian and friend, has fled from the castle where the tyrannical Marquis has been threatening her, and is wandering through Sicily, admiring the landscape. She paused in thrilling and delightful wonder. A group of wild and grotesque rocks rose in a semicircular form, and their fantastic shapes exhibited nature in her most sublime and striking attitudes. Here her vast magnificence elevated the mind of the beholder to enthusiasm. Fancy caught the thrilling sensation, and in her touch the towering steeps became shaded with unreal glooms again. The caves more darkly frowned. The projecting cliffs assumed a more terrific aspect, and the wild overhanging shrubs waved to the gales in in deeper murmurs. Yes, you'll see that she uses many of the same words for landscape that she uses for her heroine's experience of supernatural thrills. Yes, thrilling, terrific, thrilling again, gloom, enthusiasm. This is all very excitable stuff. And she gets it from travel books. She also gets it from here, from Salvatore Rosa, her favorite painter. And this is a painting by him, Bandits on the Rocky Coast, from the late 1650s. And in the late 18th century, Salvatore Rosa was very fashionable in England. And one of the reasons Anne Radcliffe loved him was for his rugged landscapes, but also he often had banditti. And every Anne Radcliffe novel has banditti in, yes? Even if you're in France, you get banditti. I don't know what they're called in France, but she calls them banditti, yes? And indeed, Count Montoni, who rules the Castle of Udolpho, is revealed to be the chief of a group of banditti. And twice in her novels, Anne Radcliffe actually says it was such a scene as if Salvatore had painted it. So she's quite explicit about hoping that her educated readers will recognize this kind of scenery in her books. Now, the extraordinary thing about Anne Radcliffe is that she toyed with the supernatural, but in the end, in all her novels, there is a rational explanation for everything that has seemed supernatural. And her Gothic novels were often referred to as the explained supernatural. And it's what I want to talk about in the last 10 or 15 minutes of this lecture. The explained supernatural and its influence. Because in her own day, many critics mocked her for explaining the supernatural, as if she did not have the courage to write a proper, frightening story with ghosts and omens and supernatural interventions. Writers like Coleridge, and some other romantic poets who used the supernatural in their own poems, read Radcliffe and felt that it was timido, yes? That it was she did not have the courage to go through with the supernatural apprehensions she had aroused. But I think that whether she had courage or not, she was doing something quite important, which other writers have, as I will show you in a couple of examples, much borrowed from. Because she used the supernatural to excite the imaginations of her heroines, her main characters, and her readers, to show them, to let them thrill to the power of their own fantasy, but then to return them to the world they truly lived in. And I wanted to take a couple of examples of the explained supernatural in the work of much greater writers than Anne Radcliffe, because in some ways it is her gift. It was her gift to later fiction, and it is still her gift, I think. I have one example at the end from the 21st century. Here is a novel, I don't know if it's known in Spain. It's fantastic in every sense. It is a wonderful, wonderful novel, Charlotte Bronte's Villette. It is better than Jane Eyre. Wow, yeah, wow. It's better, even better. It was her last novel, okay? I will tell you very quickly the situation before I read the extracts. The heroine, it is narrated like Jane Eyre by the main character. She is called Lucy Snow. She is in her early 20s. She is a mysterious person who keeps secret from you, the reader, many things. She has been very unhappy. We don't know why. She has fallen in love with somebody, maybe. We don't know. She leaves England and goes to a country which we recognize is Belgium, to a city that we recognize as Brussels. And we know that because the author Charlotte Bronte herself went and taught in Brussels. But in Villette, it is not Belgium, it is not Brussels. The country is called La Basse-Cour, and the city is called Villette, little town. Not Brussels, Villette. It is a strange alternative version of a real place. And she goes and teaches in a girls' boarding school, a pensionnat, which is full of secrets and whispers and throbbing sexual passion, scarcely repressed. And part of the school used to be a nunnery. And the school has a garden. And it's also very important, one more thing, Lucy Snow is a very devout Protestant. And at the school, everybody else is a Catholic. And Lucy Snow finds this really strange. And in the school there is a garden with an old pear tree, which used to be in the garden of the nunnery. And beneath the pear tree, set into the grass, is a stone, a flagstone. And a legend grows up amongst these girls, teenage girls again, about this. The legend went, unconfirmed and unaccredited, this is Lucy telling us, but still propagated, that this was the portal of a vault, imprisoning deep beneath that ground on whose surface grass grew and flowers bloomed, the bones of a girl whom a monkish conclave of the drear Middle Ages had there buried alive for some sin against her vow. Her shadow it was that tremblers had feared through long generations after her poor frame was dust. Her black robe and white veil that for timid eyes moonlight and shade had mocked as they fluctuated in the night wind through the garden thicket. The ghost of a nun. Romantic rubbish, says Lucy Snow. But then one day, she has retreated to the attic of the garret of the school to read a letter she has been sent by a man that she thinks maybe she loves and who might maybe be interested in her. And she finds this secret place and she hears and sees something. Most surely and certainly I heard, as it seemed, a stealthy foot on that floor, a sort of gliding out from the direction of the black recess haunted by the malefactor cloaks. I turned. My light was dim. The room was long, but as I live, I saw in the middle of that ghostly chamber a figure, all black and white, the skirts straight, narrow, black, the head bandaged, veiled, white. Say what you will, reader. Tell me I was nervous or mad. Affirm that I was unsettled by the excitement of that letter. Declare that I dreamed. This I vow. I saw there, in that room, on that night, an image like a nun. I cried out. I sickened. Well, we remember Emily, don't we, in the Mysteries of Udolpho? Whoa. Twice more, Lucy sees the apparition of the nun. But it is very important, I haven't got time to show you, but you must believe me. It is very important that on each of the occasions, it is when Lucy is romantically aroused. The first time was the letter. The next time she sees the nun, it is when she is burying her old letters from the man that she once loved but did not really love her back. She is burying them in the garden at night, and she sees the nun again. And the third time is when the French teacher, Monsieur Paul, with whom she starts having maybe a bit of a romantic attachment, maybe. And they have an extraordinary conversation, and he says to her, we are the same. We are spirits who are destined to be together. We are like each other. Ooh. And then she sees the nun again. And he sees the nun, okay? It's a Charlotte Bronte nun. And you think when you're reading the novel for the first time, my goodness, what is going on? We're in the Mysteries of Udolpho or something. And we are. We are in the Mysteries of Udolpho. Because was there a ghost? No, there wasn't a ghost. Much further on in the novel, Lucy and we get the explanation. One of the pupils in the school, who is herself about 17 years old, is called Ginevra. And she's very beautiful, rich, and glamorous. And she has been having a secret relationship with a young man who climbs over the walls at night, dressed as a nun. Of course! Of course he's dressed as a nun. Because, you'll find out, this is the letter that Ginevra leaves to Lucy when she elopes. Okay, Ginevra elopes with the young man to go off and get married without their parents' permission. And she leaves this letter which offers the explanation. Do you begin to comprehend by this time that Monsieur le Comte de Hamal, the young man, was the nun of the attic, and that he came to see your humble servant? I will tell you how he managed it. Nearly a year ago, I chanced to tell him our legend of the nun. That suggested his romantic, that word again, that his romantic idea of the spectral disguise, which I think you must allow he has very cleverly carried out. But for the nun's black gown and white veil, he would have been caught again and again, both by you and that tiger Jesuit, Monsieur Paul. He thinks you both capital ghost seers and very brave. This, I had collected some more examples of the way that great Victorian novelists like Charlotte Bronte borrowed this Gothic element. You think the supernatural might exist, but it doesn't. Or you can't be sure. Or the characters think that it might, but then change their minds. You will be very sad to hear that as time runs out, I don't have time to go through all of these, but I thought you could have a look at one of the most famous, the novel by Charlotte Bronte's sister, Emily, Wuthering Heights, and which begins, really, with the narrator, Lockwood, having to stay in Wuthering Heights, a novel, of course, named after an old house perhaps full of ghosts. And after reading the books and diary entries which once belonged to Catherine Earnshaw, he has a nightmare. He has a nightmare where he hears tapping on the window and a voice asking to be let in and clasping his hand, and he has to rub this arm till blood flows until he can get back into the room. It is only a dream. Only a dream. But when his screams awake Heathcliff, Heathcliff runs in, opens the window and says, come in, Cathy. As he says later in the novel, I believe in ghosts. And Wuthering Heights ends with Lockwood returning to Wuthering Heights after burying Heathcliff in the churchyard and meeting a small boy with his sheep. And the boy is crying. And he says to the boy, why are you crying? And he says, I've just seen the dead spirit of Heathcliff and a woman. I've just seen their ghosts, and I'm frightened. I don't want to go that way anymore. Of course, Wuthering Heights does not require any more than the Mysteries of Udolpho does you to believe that the supernatural is there, but it requires you to think the characters might do so. To end with, I promised you some more recent examples. I'm going to skip through my Dickens, quel dommage, and I'm going to get to first something from the late 19th century, and then something from very recent, and then I will shut up. This is Henry James's brilliant ghost story, The Turn of the Screw. The ghost story is a slightly different thing, I think, from the Gothic novel, but they are connected. And the Turn of the Screw is narrated in the first person by a governess who thinks that she sees the ghosts of two dead servants in a big old house, of course, called Bly. And the first time she sees this man on the top of a tower, she says this: it was not that I didn't wait on this occasion for more, for I was rooted as deeply as I was shaken. Was there a secret at Bly, a mystery of Udolpho, or an insane and unmentionable relative kept in unsuspected confinement? I can't say how long I turned it over, or how long in a confusion of curiosity and dread I remained where I had my collision. I only recall that when I re-entered the house, darkness had quite closed in. Was there a mystery of Udolpho? Henry James not just Henry James. His narrator, the unnamed woman, knows that in Udolpho all the mysteries are explained. And she also refers to an insane and unmentionable relative kept in unsuspected confinement. That, I'm sure you will all recognize, is Rochester's wife in Jane Eyre, kept up, locked up, so that all the strange events of the novel, which the servants think are to do with ghosts, are explained. He has kept his wife, his mad wife, shut up. Is there an explanation, or is there something really supernatural? Gothic lives on in contemporary literary fiction. This is my last passage. And it comes from near the end of a wonderful novel, I think, by Sarah Waters. I don't know if you've heard of her in Spain. She's very well known in Britain. She's always a runner-up for the Booker Prize. Always a runner-up. And this is a novel set in an old house. The narrator is a man called Faraday, a doctor. He is not superstitious. It is set in the late 1940s, just after the Second World War. All sorts of terrible things have happened, and we are right at the end of the novel. The man living in the house is in an insane asylum, a mental hospital. The woman who owns the house has died. Her daughter has died accidentally in terrible circumstances. She has fallen down the staircase. And there is no one left in the house. And it is almost ruined. But Faraday still has a key. And when he is not working, he goes back to this house and looks around it and wonders about the events that took place there. He refers here to his fellow doctor, Seeley. He is the other doctor in his practice. So many terrible things have happened. The people living in the house became convinced that it was possessed by spirits. What does he think? I've never attempted to remind Seeley of his other, odder theory, that Hundreds, that's the name of the house, Hundreds Hall, was consumed by some dark germ, some ravenous shadow creature, some little stranger spawned from the troubled unconscious of someone connected with the house itself. But on my solitary visits, I find myself growing watchful. Every so often, I will sense a presence or catch a movement at the corner of my eye, and my heart will give a jolt of fear and expectation. I'll imagine that the secret is about to be revealed to me at last. I have twice interviewed the author, Sarah Waters, in front of an audience like this about this novel. At the end, there are questions, and someone always says, Sarah, can you tell me, is it a ghost? A question which shows that she is still exploring this same territory where the supernatural has an explanation, if you want it, and yet where our faculties have been heightened into terror by the possibility that it does not. And again, we end near where we began. Yes, Northanger Abbey, a house. Strawberry Hill, a house. Udolpho, a castle. We end in this old, ruined English house. The house is where the fantastic is strangest and strongest. It is a huge old building that novelists still inhabit. Thank you.